Not every pot works out. This fact is hard to grasp for every potter, especially when they've grown attached to their pieces. Thankfully, this reality is softened by the fact that clay is one of, if not the most recyclable art forms out there. So, if someone fails, they can always reclaim or re-wedge the clay and start again. This process of reclamation begins by soaking the dry scraps in water. The liquid you see here is my already dirty throwing water, hence the foul color. The water slicks the scraps down into a slurry that can be dried out into reusable clay. As you can see, I didn't add quite enough water, and it's always better to slightly overfill than underfill. Next, I have to pop the lid on and allow it to sit overnight. The worst part of this process is arduously removing the excess water resting on top of the clay scoop by scoop before homogenizing it with my hands. While this process is a pain, it is the cost of properly overfilling the bucket with water. Also, this process doesn't make the most pleasing sounds, but neither do most steps in ceramics, unfortunately. Once it's well mixed, I raise my reclaimed bucket onto my work table to make scooping it out onto the canvas-covered plywood a touch easier on my back. This surface allows clay to dry out faster while being non-stick. It also helps out when I need to lift and cut the clay for wedging later. After ensuring that it's in a thin enough layer, I place it upright against my recycling bin so the sunlight can dry it out a touch faster and conserve space in my already extremely tiny studio. 3 days later, the stoneware is finally dry enough to be wedged and used. I cut away small chunks to make the wedging process easier on my arms. These pieces I'm wedging here are probably around 3 to 5 pounds each. However, I'm probably only going to need 2 pounds for a normal sized bowl. As for the actual process of wedging, I press the lump of clay down and forward before lifting it back up and pressing down again. I repeat this process many a time until I feel like it's fully homogenized. After this quite monotonous process is finished, I can finally start creating the bowl. First, I use a wire cutter to remove a hunk of clay that's to my liking. I used to have a scale that I used to measure out every ball of clay I threw, but unfortunately it broke a while back, which means I have to eyeball the weight of every piece I make. Although I wedged up the larger log of clay earlier, I still need to wedge up this smaller piece of clay to homogenize it completely. Next, I throw the piece of clay down onto the wheel head and begin centering it. Centering consists of 2 techniques, coning and what I call the karate chop technique. Coning is where I brace my left elbow into my hip, keep my left hand at 6 o'clock, and draw the clay towards me with my right hand at roughly 1 o'clock. Since my left hand is firmly braced, the clay flows up into a cone, hence the name, coning. I then place my right hand on top of this cone, slightly tip it over to one side, and gently press it down back into a puck shape. If I'm being completely honest, I'm not entirely sure what this process does, but I know it leads to more successful throws. I've really only incorporated this technique within the last year, but, as I've said, it has greatly improved my throwing abilities. The karate chop technique is similar to coning in what my left hand does, but instead of drawing the clay up, my right hand presses it down. This puts the stoneware in a box created by my hands, forcing it to spin centrally. Before I show you how I open this lump of clay, allow me to explain the difference between opening a bowl and a typical shape, like a vase or cup. During a normal opening, the base is made to be decently thin and the walls meet it at a rough 90-degree angle. When finished, the 90-degree angle would be maintained and a shallow footwell would be trimmed. On the other hand, a bowl's base is left quite thick and the interior more curvaceous. This produces a bowl with a curved interior and tall foot that requires more trimming to hollow out. I adore these pedestal-like feet because they make the pot feel more elegant, so I tend to stray away from the shape on the left when making bowls. Now, let's get back to the actual throwing. The actual opening is quite simple. All I have to do is plunge my left thumb and right index finger into the middle of the clay, forming that concave shape shown in the drawings. I also optionally draw the clay up to make throwing the interior a little bit easier later on. The next and hardest step of this process is pulling. This is where I pinch the clay between slightly offset fingers and pull it upwards. I have to do multiple pulls because if I attempted to get it ultra thin in one pull, the clay would tear itself apart and I'd be left with a ruined bowl. Up until this point, I've attempted to keep it fairly vertical for stability, but now I will gently press out on the inside of the bowl to widen it. Similar to pulling, my hands have to move in a very consistent manner so as not to create an undulation. After messing with the shape a bit, it's finally where I want it to be and I can start my refinement process. First, I remove the skirt of clay near the foot to aid me in lifting away the pot. I use two tools for this, the first of which removes a majority of the clay, while the second one cleans up the foot and makes it more vertical. Next, I use a sharp metal kidney tool to remove the slip from the outside of the pot, before using a very tattered sponge to remove the excess water on the inside of the bowl. I then use the same sharp metal kidney tool in order to remove the slip from the inside of the bowl. By removing all of this slip, it will allow the bowl to dry faster later on. In order to lift it away from the wheel head, I must slide a wire cutter under the pot, dig my fingers into the foot of the bowl, and gently lift it. Unfortunately, as I was setting it down onto the wear board, I warped it and... Failure is inevitable. I am human after all. In fact, I failed to throw the bowl right afterwards. What really matters is our willingness to get up and try again after failure. However, at this point, I was quite peeved, and my clay was far too soft, so I decided to step away for a few hours. After I came back, the stoneware was firmer and my head was level. To let it dry further, I let the train wrecks rest on the same plywood I used for reclaim for my time off before re-wedging it and throwing it once again. After repeating the process for the third time that day, I was able to pluck away the bowl and successfully place it down onto my wear board. Third time's the charm. And now begins the bowl's 36-hour drying process. Mid-second day, the entire bowl is at a stage called leather hard and is ready to trim. First, I have to apply a layer of slip to the bottom of the pot, which will dry and stick it to the wheel head as I tap center it. Tap centering is a tricky process to explain, but essentially, I give the pot a light tap every time I see it spin closer to my hand as compared to the rest of the body. It's a skill that many potters find tricky, and, with most things regarding pottery, the skill comes with repetition. After the pot's stuck down and centered, I can start removing the excess clay. I tend to work from top to bottom while trimming, grasping my tools very firmly so as to not let the swaying pot underneath influence my movements. Although this is seen as sacrilege to some potters, I typically trim both the inside and outsides of my pots in order to achieve the finish I would like. I'm certainly not a purist when it comes to pottery. I simply make what I think looks good and copy artists I admire. To finish off this top section, I burnish both the lip and the inside of the bowl with my sharp metal kidney tool. With the upper section trimmed, I can slide the metal kidney underneath the base to detach from the wheel and begin trimming the base. Because the rim is now very delicate, I use 3 lugs of clay to secure the bowl down instead of slip. It doesn't provide as strong a hold, but I won't be applying any horizontal pressure anyways. First, I trimmed the lower section of the bowl that was inaccessible while it was sitting upright. Because this pot is quite angular, I attempt to make all planes on this as straight as possible. I achieve this with steady hand movements and using the flat end of this trimming tool. I then clean up the foot to make it more vertical. While the tool I used while throwing did a decent job, it's very scruffy as compared to what I can achieve at the leather hard stage. Finally, I burnished the lower section and foot before moving on to the toughest part of this entire process. First, I have to create one half of the beveled edge. Once finished, the base will have a smaller point of contact, making it less prone to chipping. The next and hardest part that I mentioned is actually hollowing out the foot. If this process is rushed, I can easily trim a hole through the bottom of the bowl, but if the base is left too thick, it can lead to S-cracks. So, using the flat end of this trimming tool, I remove the clay layer by layer. For the first few passes, I can be quite aggressive since I know that there's plenty of clay left, but as I get closer to the bottom of the foot, I have to be much more cautious. Periodically, I tap the base to hear what sound it makes. If it makes a low thud sound like this, the base is still far too thick. However, if I tap it and it makes a higher pitch like this, the base is thin enough and I can start adding the final touches. The first of which is finishing that beveled edge I mentioned earlier. I also ensure that this beveled edge is as clean as possible since it's going to be the only portion of exposed clay on this entire pot. Finally, I get to etch my maker's mark into the bottom of the pot with the needle tool. This mark has stuck with me throughout my entire ceramics journey. With the pot burnished to my liking, I pluck away the lugs of clay and remove the bowl from the wheel, placing it onto my wear board along the dozens of other pots I've collected over these last few months. Finally, I place the trimmings back into my reclaim bucket, starting the process of creation all over again. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.